Can real-world behavioral relationships between predator and prey be applied to EVEOnline? Here to answer that, please welcome Capsuleer Zkadon Estermaire.
There it is. Awesome. Great. So I'm an evolutionary biologist. It's a lot of fun because I get to wear lots of different hats. Some applied aspects, I look at the commercial turtle harvesting. So in the state of Maryland, you can commercially harvest snapping turtles. And so when I started grad school, they didn't have any regulations. I had very few regulations in the turtle harvest. So being the state then convened a working group. So they got scientists and harvesters and advocacy groups, and they put them all into a room, and they said, come up with some kind of regulations that would make this harvest sustainable. And then me being the bright-eyed grad student in the room, they all looked at me and said, go collect data. So I did. I went out with commercial turtle harvesters. They measured turtles, hundreds a day that they usually collect, and then it led to some kind of regulations. Some observational aspects. I look at the evolution of signaling traits. These are lizards that the males will defend territories. And so if an intruder comes in, they'll square off with each other and then do a whole bunch of push-ups. And they'll show off these bright blue bellies and probably convey some kind of information with fighting ability. They don't want to fight. Fighting is dangerous. It leads to injuries, probably death. And that's not such a good thing. So they try to figure out who's going to win before they actually get to fighting. But with these lizards, they can see into ultraviolet. They can see things that we can't. And so I wanted to see if there's any components in the signals that they convey that had UV, or if UV would be important at all. And it turns out it is pretty interesting. There's a lot of UV information that they have in these patches that they might use to evaluate fighting ability. And then my favorite part about being an evolutionary ecologist is the theoretical aspect, and that's specifically predator-prey dynamics. Predator-prey dynamics goes all the way back to the Latko-Volterra models, where they modeled population cycles based on population size. And they can be cyclical, they can reach an equilibrium, and it's a really, really good starting point for things. It's also an alliance. Right? Is anybody here from Latko-Volterra? Nobody? It's kind of an old one. All right. But one of the limitations with population cycling is that it doesn't convey everything with this particular conflict. There's behaviors that take place, and we want to see what behaviors might be the best to determine this conflict and optimize some kind of payoff. Right? So game theory comes into this. Game theory is basically a study of conflict. It's just three major components. You have players. That can be one player or many players. There's strategies that these players can take to try to optimize what we call a payoff. So what is the thing that they're trying to do the best at? One of the classic game theory, one of the classic games out there is called the prisoner's dilemma. The idea here is that you and your partner just got arrested for robbing a bank, and they have you in a room by yourself, and your partner's in another room somewhere else, and they say, well, if you confess, we'll let you go and put everything on your partner. And so you can either stay quiet, and if your partner stays quiet, then you'll both get off probably scot-free. But if you stay quiet and your partner confesses, you go to jail for a really long time. So you have two players, you have different strategies. You can either cooperate or defect, So I play this with my students in evolution class, and I give them cards, and then they pair off for about 10 rounds, and they get to play either of the two strategies. And it's adorable because the students usually start off cooperating. Everybody's nice by nature, as much as CCP doesn't want you to be nice. But there's always that one student that either kind of gets it or is just a really mean person or wasn't listening to my directions and played a random strategy that starts off defecting. And then, so they start accumulating a lot of points. And all the people who are cooperating feel like suckers, right? Because this person just took all the points and they got nothing for it. So about round 5 or 6, everybody is playing the defecting strategy, the selfish strategy. And so in 1977, there was a tournament that was held that wanted to try to figure out what would the best, if somebody could write code that could win Prisoner's Dilemma to get the best payoff. There was about 14 submissions. This was written in Fortran and BASIC, I think. They put those scripts into a giant mainframe computer, waited overnight. Each strategy was played 200 times against all the other strategies. And then there was another strategy that was just a random. It would select random, either defect or cooperate. And then they were surprised by the winner. The winner happened to be written by this guy. And he's an expert in peace, which is kind of weird because this is studying conflict. And they expected that the code would be really, really complex. This was the same time that they were writing code to beat humans in chess, and they thought it would be hundreds or thousands of lines of code. It actually just happened to be a few lines of code. And basically the strategy was start off by cooperating, and then anytime you meet that player again, you do whatever they did to you. So if they cooperated, you cooperate again. If they defected, then you defect again. And that happened to be the best strategy, and there were 2 tournaments, and it happened to be the best in both of those. It's called tit for tat, right? We see Prisoner's Dilemma all over the place. We see it in climate change. So if you have a whole bunch of countries that get together, and they'll say, we want to reduce emissions, right? There's maybe one country out there that says, if I don't reduce emissions, I stand to gain economically. And then all the other countries that have been doing it, they'll say, well, I don't want to be a sucker, so then everybody ends up not reducing submissions. It's also in dating. When you go on a date for the first time, you can be completely honest with your date and say everything about you. But if your date holds a lot of their stuff back, then you kind of feel like a sucker. So everybody on the first date tends to hold everything back. There's a really great example of Prisoner's Dilemma in World War II. The Japanese wanted to reinforce some areas in New Guinea, and they had 2 routes that they could send their ships through. Either a northern route, which was pretty stormy and cloudy, and then a southern route, which wasn't. And the Allied Air Force knew this. The Allied Air Force wanted to maximize the number of days that they could use to bomb the Japanese Navy. And so they thought, well, what would the Japanese do? If they could take the northern route, it has lots of cloud cover, lots of storms, that's going to inhibit the ability to bomb these ships. Then if they go to the southern route, where if we go north, they're going to have a great time, but if we go south, then we'll have lots of days to bomb them. So the payoff is more risky in the southern route. So the Japanese ended up going to northern route, and the Allies predicted that. There's a variation of the Prisoner's Dilemma. It's called the Hawk-Dove game. This kind of incorporates some kind of more conflict. So if you play a hawk, then you'll be more aggressive and you'll steal resources from who you play with. If you play a dove, you won't. So you could play a risky one, because if you're a hawk and you get paired up with a dove, then you take all the dove's resources and nothing happens to you. But it's more risky in that if you end up meeting another hawk, then you're going to both lose resources, both be injured, and that's a problem, right? So one of the questions I ask in my research is, can game theory predict animal behavior? Can we use game theory to figure out why animals make the decisions that they do? One of the central tenets in foraging ecology is trying to figure out how we can explain how foragers distribute amongst habitats. Right? So if you have a bunch of foragers and you have patches with resources in them, how are they going to distribute amongst those resources? And what you'd predict is that the foragers would go to patches based on how many resources there is. So the forager density ratio, the number of foragers, should match the amount of resources available. This is called the ideal free distribution. And you could see this all over the place too. If you go to a pond and you put 2 people on either end of the pond and they start feeding bread out into the pond at different rates, you'll see more geese go towards the higher rate than the lower rate. And yeah, that's the ideal free distribution. But another question is, how can we get non-perfect matching for these patches? One way to do that is to introduce predation risk. Or if a cloaky Loki jumps into your system, you might see a bunch of resource gatherers, miners move out into other less risky type of patches. So we wanted to study this using game theory, where specifically where the players would affect each other's decisions. Your decision depends on what your opponent is going to do. A limitation so far is that typically the research will fix one side or the other. So you'll fix the predator's behavior and see what the prey do, or you'll fix the prey's behavior and then see what the predator does. But if you let them play simultaneously, you should see that the prey will allocate towards being safe in a refuge or going out and foraging and getting energy and converting that energy into babies. And then the predators should manage the prey's fear. And this comes from something called the waiting game. And the idea here is that you have a predator that chases a prey into a refuge. That's when the waiting game starts. So the predator knows that the prey is in the refuge. It has to decide how long it's going to wait for the prey to come out, or it can decide to leave. And it can go off, try to hunt some other prey, and get the element of surprise or something like that. The prey also has a waiting game. It needs to figure out, I just got chased in there. I know there's a predator out there, or at least was. So how long am I going to wait in this refuge where I'm safe? But I need to get out there and I need to start foraging. I need to get that energy to make babies. Right? One way that this was tested empirically was by some folks in Israel. They had this enclosure, had a bunch of kiddie pools around. Inside those kiddie pools were goldfish. So in the center, there's a refuge. They can hide in the refuge, or they can go outside where they can feed. And then they would let a little egret go into the enclosure. And the little egret would go from pond to pond and try to eat goldfish. So we could see that time allocation for the prey, and also the managing of the predators. So with our game model, let's just think of those two players, goldfish and a little egret. And so with our game, we have two patches. And the first patch is broken up into two parts, where the prey can move either from a refuge, where it's safe from predation, but it can't forage, or it can move out into what we call the open, where it can forage, but it's exposed to predation risk. The predator can move between the open, where it can hunt prey, or it can move into the environment. The environment is a fixed intake, if you think of it that way. So, or just a goldfish bowl, that we can control the number of goldfish. So it's something static, something that gives the predator a choice to either hunt or go to this expected amount of food. Just lets us wiggle something. So with two places that the prey can go to and two places that the predator can go to, there's 4 states. But we wanted to be more explicit about information. So when the prey is in a refuge, just on its own time allocation, that's different than when it was chased in there. So we added 2 more states where the prey is in the refuge because it just got attacked by a predator. Right? And then a predator can be either in the environment or the open. With 6 states, we can create a transition matrix. It looks something like this. So state R23 is just while the predator is in the open, the prey moves from the refuge to the open. So that's the rate that the prey leaves the refuge. State R sub 02 is the rate that from state 0 to 2, that's the rate that the predator enters the open, right? So while the prey is in the refuge. We had a couple of assumptions that there's no moving simultaneously. There's a non-zero probability that they would move at the same exact time, but it was so small, we just considered it 0. We also assumed that the predator would never leave the open when the prey was in the open. It would never come in, see prey, and then just decide to leave. We didn't allow that. So with a transition matrix, we can then calculate eigenvectors to figure out the proportion of time spent in each of those 6 states. So pi sub 3 in this case is just the amount of time of the total time that they're playing where both players are in the open. And then from the eigenvectors, we can use a proportion of states we can use the eigenvectors to determine fitness functions. And fitness is just a way that we think of the payoff, right? So each player is trying to maximize their own fitness. So the fitness function is this massive beast, but it's just broken up into several parts. So this first element is the intake that it gets from the open. This is a movement cost. We found that if you didn't have a movement cost, the prey would just act like an electron field, just be a probability field. It moved back and forth really, really fast. And then this is the probability of survival. The prey fitness function is very similar. You get the intake from the open. You've got the intake from the environments, and then it also has a movement cost. So with these fitness functions, we utilized a tool called adaptive dynamics. This assumes a monomorphic population, so every individual in this population exhibits the same exact behavior. But if a mutant shows up, and let's say it has a slightly better fitness than everyone else, given enough time, that population should evolve to that particular behavior. So we can calculate, or we can figure out one particular behavior. So in this case, with the predator, the rate that it goes to the open, we can use the fitness functions to calculate the fitness if it was a slightly faster behavior or if it was a slightly slower behavior. And then that will give us a fitness curve. We can calculate the tangent of that curve, and if it's positive, then we'll slightly increase the behavior in the next generation. If the tangent is negative, we'll slightly decrease the behavior in the next generation. Right? And then so if you let them play, you'll see something like this. We always wanted them to go to some kind of equilibrium that wasn't zero, a rate of zero. And so you'll see them kind of start to play quite a bit, and then they reached an equilibrium. So we asked a couple different questions. How does our model stand up to previous models, right? These static predator-prey models. We wanted to be on par with those. What happens if they play simultaneously? That's the really, really interesting question. And then also, what's the importance of information? So we had 4 different models: static prey, static predator. We had a game where there was no information, so the prey went into the refuge and then didn't consider whether it was attacked by a predator or not. And then the full game is where there is information and where they can play simultaneously. And so with some of the results, you get something like this. There's lots and lots of interesting things. Go read the paper. It's pretty fun. But I'm going to talk about the third column. So this is with a high missed opportunity cost. So think of this like a giant fishbowl full of fish. So the predator always has that option to go get a high payoff by going to that environment. We also wiggled the lethality of the predator. So when a predator is really, really bad at capturing prey, it doesn't even bother, right? That's pretty intuitive. That makes sense. And so the red part of the third graph on the right is them not playing at all. But as a predator gets better at capturing prey, it spends a little bit more time in the open trying to hunt prey. But it'll go in, if the prey's not there, it leaves immediately. Or if it goes in, it'll attack the prey. It won't wait at all because it has that high missed opportunity cost. And this was pretty interesting. This is a hypothesis. I thought a lot about it, like where could we see this in nature? And I was reading a paper that had nothing really to do with this particular project. It had to do with ultraviolet signals in fiddler crabs. And one of the things in the methods that they talked about was it was really easy to capture these fiddler crabs. They would purposefully chase them into their refuge, and then after just a couple of minutes, the fiddler crab would emerge, and they would just grab it. And in this paper, they even say that doesn't make sense. If there's a predator, a smart enough predator, it should have evolved to just pick these things off like popcorn. It's a very predictable behavior. And so, yeah, you shouldn't see this in fiddler crabs. But our model predicts that you can see this if the predator has a high missed opportunity cost, right? If it's something like a gull, it's going to go in, chase it, and then just take off, right? Because it's going to go somewhere else. Right? And so the neat thing is that we see this a lot in EVEOnline, right? So we do this every day. You've got miners, you've got people who like to blow up miners. We see these kinds of behaviors quite a bit. We also see it in the economics. So there's a lot of great economics talks that took place today. And I liked it was the tycoon one, where he's like, I just set up shop in the systems that I could pronounce. right? It could be a little more refined. You can use game theory to try to figure out the things that aren't necessarily intuitive, but might maximize your payoffs. But yeah, it doesn't have to be very mathematical either. There's lots of different ways to do it. Or if you're into transportation. So if you need to get 50 billion worth of cargo from one place to another, you can use game theory to try to maximize this. And again, we do this intuitively. We think about risks and duration and costs and that sort of thing. But game theory formalizes that and could put it more into context and show you things that maybe you're not thinking about. Right? And so how is EVE Online unique? It's just an incredible ecosystem, right? You guys do this. As a scientist, I want to see predator-prey dynamics out in nature, but it's really, really hard. Seeing an actual predation event is pretty impossible. You have to be at the right place at the right time. It usually happens very quickly, and so you can't really observe that in nature. And then if you take predators and bring them into an enclosure and you try to do an experiment that way, predators are a pain in the ass. They don't like to behave when you want them to. And so, yeah, is anybody from CCP here? Can I do something like Project Discovery, but I don't know, Project Predator, maybe? I just want to look at data because you guys are doing this, and I want to study you, right? I want to test my hypotheses because this is just a very, very great way to do this. And then, yeah, if you're really, really interested in this, or even starting to be interested in this, I highly recommend this book. It's How Not to Be Wrong. So Jordan Ellenberg uses lots of examples of real life and approaches them from a mathematical mindset. And it's not mathematical at all. So if that's not your strong suit, like me, I'm not, math isn't my strong suit. I highly recommend this book. It'll just make your thinking much, much different in everyday problem solving and that sort of thing. So yeah, that's my talk. If you have any questions, feel free to buy me a beer. I'll tell you anything you want. So, all right. Thank you.